right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome back for another CRA education session, our second one this week. Some of you may have joined us on Tuesday. If so, thanks for joining us again. My name is Jackie, and I'm part of the social equity team with the Cannabis Regulatory Agency. Today, we are happy to have Janelle Trohill, air permit engineer, and Nathaniel Gentle, air inspector with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy's Air Quality Division. They'll be walking us through what it looks like from an air permitting perspective, as well as what an air inspector may be looking for when they visit. To keep things moving, we encourage you to ask questions as you think of them during the presentation. You can do so by typing them out in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. So let's go ahead and get things started. And Nathaniel, you can take it away.
Thanks, Jackie. So as Jackie said, my name is Nathaniel. I'm an air inspector with the State of Michigan Air Quality Division. Joining me is Janelle Trohill. She's one of our permit engineers. And today we'll be giving you guys an overview of cannabis and air quality regulations. So to start things off, we'll just give you a little bit of a background of who we are. We work for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or as you'll commonly hear is called EGLE. What we do is we regulate how a company can operate, such as release of air pollutants, dispose of waste, use water resources, and use of land. We have developed a marijuana and industrial hemp environmental guidance to support the industry in complying with our rules and protecting Michigan's resources. This can include overviews, rules, requirements, white papers, training, and more. We also work closely with the state's Cannabis Regulatory Agency, also known as the CRA. So as I said, we work closely with the Cannabis Regulatory Agency. Cannabis regulations with the CRA require compliance with our EGLE rules. To facilitate information sharing, EGLE and CRA do have regular joint meetings. We will conduct joint inspections at facilities. We'll share violations if they are identified, and we'll also conduct multi-agency training. This can include for agency staff, licensees, municipalities, as well as associations. So this slide we have is a map that we pulled from the CRA website. It's a map of facilities in the state of Michigan. Primarily what we're highlighting on this map is growers and processors. As you can see, there are numerous cannabis facilities in the state. While not all of them need an air permit, some of them may, and we'll go into more detail today on when a permit may be necessary. So as an AQD inspector, I'm going to go a little bit over of what I'll be looking at if I were to come to your facility. So primarily what I'm going to be looking for is identifying processes on site with air emissions. Once we identify these processes, the next question will be, do these processes have an air permit or do they need one? If they do have an air permit already, I'll then be looking at how are you assuring compliance with your permit. If you don't have a permit, next thing we'll be looking at is an exemption being used to not need a permit, or is there potentially a violation in place? Now, if the process does meet the requirements of exemption, we'll be evaluating that and determining if sufficient documentation is being maintained. You're muted, Janelle.
The Air Quality Division regulates all marijuana and hemp facilities with the same set of rules that apply to similar industrial processes. There are no air quality regulations specifically focused on cannabis. Now, at EGLE, our air permitting program requires companies needing an air permit to apply for and have an approved air permit in hand before installing and operating the equipment that emits air pollutants. As part of starting operations, you should have assessed whether any of your process release air pollutants in quantities needing a permit, or if there is an exemption for permitting that applies. We have been working with CRA and providing resources that for the industry based on lessons learned. One of those is that companies needing a permit do not have one and are already operating. This is a challenge, and to date, we have been using enforcement discretion in working with this new industry type. We have been doing a lot of training and outreach and not a lot of enforcement. But as we get further along and companies have had time to familiarize themselves with the rules, it is likely that you'll see more violation notices and enforcement actions. This is one of the reasons we are here talking to you today. Now, we are going to look into more detail about air permits, odors, complaints, and enforcement in the coming slides. We hope we have time for questions at the end, which I'm sure we will, and we'll be sharing with you where to find resources and how to help you. Now, any process that emits air emissions needs a permit unless it meets one of the criteria or meets the criteria for an exemption. And this can be found, all the exemptions can be found in our permit to install exemption handbook. And a copy of the handbook can be obtained on the AQD website. There is, in the beginning of the exemption handbook, our Rule 278 that outlines any exclusions to using exemptions. It is important to verify that the project is not excluded from using exemptions before you want to claim an exemption. Now, documentation demonstrating that the emission unit or the project meets the exemptions is required to be maintained on site. And in addition to the state air quality rules, emission units may be subject to Federal Clean Air Act regulations. Now, I'm going to give you kind of just an overview of what the permitting process is. Now, the first thing is usually a facility plans to install or modify equipment at their facility. Usually they will contact a consultant or go on our website and work with us to put together an application and send that in. And we receive the application and review it to make sure that all the information we need is in the application. Once we receive it, we start our review process of looking at the calculations that were submitted, sometimes talking with or including the district in it to make sure if they've gone out for an inspection that everything that they had noticed was included in the application and there wasn't anything missing, and that all the information makes sense in the application. After we've gone through this review and double checked everything, we draft permit conditions and send those out for review. During this time, we have a process where a peer reviewer within the permit section will look through it to make sure that we've covered everything and that all the conditions make sense. We then send it to the district, who, since they're the ones that will be enforcing the permit themselves, making sure they understand what's in it and also getting their opinion that we've covered everything. After we get acceptance from the district, we send it to the company, and the company then has a chance to review the review the draft conditions, make any comments, see if there's any changes, and at that time also make sure that they understand what will be required when the permit gets issued. Now, sometimes public comment is the next step in this. It's not always required, only happens usually in controversial sources or sources that meet certain requirements and are subject to certain federal regulations. These are usually very large sources and wouldn't usually come into play during these kind of permitting actions. And at the end is when the Air Quality Division makes a decision on the permit, whether to issue it or deny it, depending. Now, the oil, a major part of the industry that we look at and make sure that it's meeting regulatory requirements is solvent extraction. We are currently not looking at emissions from growing or from the processing of dry plants. Now, as many of you probably know, processing facilities that extract oil from the marijuana flowers to be used in edible and vape products is what we are looking at. And normally when solvents are used to extract the oils, and these solvents can become air contaminants. Now, normally it's a closed loop system that has condensers to make sure that a lot of the solvent is recovered from this process. Well, Most of the solvent is recovered, usually at like a 95% rate or higher. A portion of it does evaporate off when the biomass is taken out of the process, and those are looked at as VOC emissions. Now, sometimes facilities often are not accounting for these emissions and do not have the necessary permits. And additionally, facilities sometimes may off-gas the solvent entrained in the plant material and plant waste, and this is another source of VOC emissions that needs to be accounted for. In addition, solvents sometimes may be used to clean the equipment, and this usage also needs to be included in the emissions. I will talk some more about the calculations of the emissions in just a minute. First, I wanted to talk to you about some of the challenges that we have and the rules that apply to this subpart of the operation. So first, let's talk about some of the challenges that we have with the facilities doing extraction from the air permit perspective. As you saw on the map earlier, there are 50 plus processors in the state. So some of these processors may be able to use exemptions, but without a proper evaluation, we don't know for sure. And currently to date, we have only about 12 permits that have been issued and one application in-house. So typically, we only inspect these facilities if we get an odor complaint or a complaint of some sort. And unfortunately, a lot of the facilities are small and don't understand how to assess the process and calculate the emissions. So the most common cannabis process, or this is one of the most common cannabis processes that would need a permit to install or a PTI. Now, the primary pollutants of concern are VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and these can also be looked at as toxic air contaminants or TACs. And this would be the solvents used such as propane, butane, ethanol, solvents such as those. Like I said, a lot of the times it's a closed loop separatory system to separate the plant oil from the solvent and get the plant oil out of the plants. While most of the solvent is recovered, a portion of it does remain in the biomass. And then also, sometimes solvent is used for cleaning the process. And then any off-gassing of extra solvent entrained into the plant waste also needs to be looked at. Now, there are some potential exemptions that could be used, and those are our Rule 290 and Rule 291, which Nathaniel will talk about in a few minutes. Now, if you remember, one of the challenges I mentioned earlier was knowing how to determine what your air emissions are. Essentially, the emissions from the solvent extraction are calculated using what's called a mass balance, meaning what goes in must come out somehow. And the simplest way to do this is to look at the beginning inventory of your solvent minus your inventory at the end of the month. So basically, how much you had to buy and had to go back to your original inventory. Now, to be conservative, the Air Quality Division assumes that all the used solvent and the replaced solvent is emitted into the air. This is because it could be emitted anywhere in the process, from as you take the biomass out of the separatory system to any additional systems that may come afterwards to refine the product. And the facility would have limits in their permit of VOCs on a ton per year basis and have to calculate it monthly and calculate a 12-month rolling time frame, which means you would add up each month for the first 11 months and then first 12 months, and then the next 13th month, the first month would drop off. Now, this is a way of calculating that applies to any oil extraction, no matter if it's marijuana, hemp, or looking at any cleaning solvents used. But we have also developed a worksheet that will help you fill out the information to calculate your emissions from oil extraction. Now, this worksheet can be found on our website under our PTI guidance. If you have any questions filling this out or have questions where to find it, feel free to contact us. Now going to have Nathaniel talk about when you may not need to have a permit for operating.
Thanks, Janelle. So in cases where emissions are very low, we do have a couple rules that allow you, under certain circumstances, to release air pollutants without needing a permit. I'm going to highlight a couple of them that may be applicable for solvent extraction processes. And I do want to say I'm only going to review these at a very high level, but I am happy to answer other questions that folks may have. So the first rule that we're going to look at, if you can go back one slide, Janelle. I think the title of the slide might have changed. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Okay, so the first rule we're going to look at is Rule 290. So I do want to say this is one of our more complicated exemptions, so I do encourage you guys to review this exemption in detail after this presentation to make sure you understand it. We do have additional guidance on our website for this specific rule. So Rule 290 is based on actual emissions from your process. So if your process emits only non-carcinogenic VOCs or other non-carcinogenic materials, and if those emissions are uncontrolled and have an emission rate of 1,000 pounds per month or less, or if they're controlled and have an emission rate of 500 pounds per month or less, you may be able to use this exemption. Now, if your process does emit toxic air contaminants, this exemption rule still may be applicable. However, you will have to do a review of screening levels for each of the individual tags and evaluate the emission rates of each. Like I said, we do have separate literature on our website for this rule, and I encourage you guys to look at it. If you do use this exemption rule, it does require records of material use as well as calculations of your monthly emissions be maintained in sufficient detail, so as if an inspector shows up, you can show that you are meeting the requirements. Another exemption rule that may be applicable is what we call Rule 291. Now, the way this one differs from Rule 290 is this one is based on potential to emit. Now, what that means is how much you could potentially emit from your process if you were to be operating 24/7. It's kind of a hypothetical calculation. And this one is a one-time demonstration. You'll just need to keep records on site of what your potential to emit is. You'll need to be able to show that you do not emit more than 5 tons per year of VOCs total. And that as well are as more stringent requirements if tags are being emitted. And again, you'd have to do a review of each individual tag and its screening level. Like I said, it allows a company to do a one-time demonstration. And as with any exemption, I encourage you to review it in more detail to make sure you meet the requirements.
All right, now some cannabis facilities may have power generation on site, whether it's primary power or emergency backup power. Both of these types need to be assessed to determine if an air permit is needed. Now, first, I want to talk to you about some of the challenges that we've seen related to power generation in the cannabis industry. Some facilities, like I said, have their own energy generation on site, including generators, boilers, and sometimes turbines. Now, for some facilities, the energy production units are for emergency use only for when energy is not available from the grid. Sometimes we have had some of the electricity companies say that they can't provide enough power to the cannabis facilities. And so these facilities have to put a whole power generation on site for their facility. These need to be evaluated. And any energy production units that have been installed and operated without first obtaining a proper permit could be in violation. These facilities sometimes are unaware that there's also federal regulations, as known as MACT or NSPS standards, that may have emission limits, may have many emission units are subject to and may have emission limits in them that you have to be certifying with. Now, looking at emissions from power generation, how it applies to your industry, no matter if it's intended use or what the industry is supporting, we look at these kind of regulations all the same. So these activities may need an air permit if they are large enough and emit enough air contaminants. However, just like with extraction, there is an exemption that may be able to be applied for limited cases. This is our Rule 285. If your engine is less than 10 million BTU of heat input and you don't meet one of those exclusions to the exemption found in Rule 278. Now, this also means, though, that there could be some federal regulations that apply to the power generation. These can be very complicated sometimes, but at the permit section, we're happy to help walk through any of these regulations to help you and find out what's necessary. And now I'm going to hand it back to Nathaniel to talk to you about odors and how we deal with complaints.
Thank you. So, as many of you I'm sure are aware, cannabis does have a more distinct odor. Growers, whether indoor or outdoor, should have an odor control plan in place to limit the release of cannabis smells, which may be a nuisance to the surrounding community. Some of these odor controls are listed on this slide. You can use things such as foggers, misters, masking agents, as well as activated carbon. I will say some growers have tried using misters or masking agents, and this can sometimes cause an unexpected issue of the community calling about a strange smell associated with it. And you can also use activated carbon and other similar systems, which have been used with success. Whichever you decide to go with, it's important to be proactive about odor control at your facility. So this slide outlines a few of the challenges that we have associated with odors, such as many indoor grows are in urban areas. Most odor complaints are from growing operations. Outdoor grows at this time are not regulated by the AQD. And also for us, staff resources can limit the ability to respond to other marijuana odor complaints. So across the state, we have received odor complaints. And as AQD, we do have authority to regulate odors from cannabis operations. And we do strive to be as responsive as possible when we do receive citizen concerns. However, due to staffing concerns that we do have a limit on the types of complaints that we will respond to directly, such as complaints from commercial or retail establishments. Those we are directing to the local unit of government at this time. As I stated previously, controlling and minimizing odors from your facility should be part of your business plan. If we do receive complaints and we conduct an odor investigation that leads to a determination of a violation of our rules, you may be issued a violation notice that would require a plan to return it into compliance. So what can you do when it comes to odors? Number one thing is to be proactive and have an odor minimization plan in place. This can include identifying times when odors are strongest, such as flowering, and apply your best strategies. You can also install activated carbon or other such systems and ensure that your air system is properly maintained, designed, and monitored. As well as another thing you can do is communicate with residents around you. Sometimes being transparent with your community combined with being prepared to tackle tough odors head on is the best way to improve relationships and keep complaints at a minimum. So what happens if you're listening to this presentation and you're thinking, I have an oil extraction process or I have an energy generation unit on site and I don't have a permit? What should I do? First thing to do is don't panic, but also don't wait for an inspector such as myself to discover this problem for you. This will increase your likelihood of getting a violation notice from us and possibly having to undergo escalated enforcement, which could include fines. The number one thing to do is don't delay in your permitting assessment. And if you do determine you need a permit, apply for one as soon as possible. And as always, EGLE is here to help if you have questions. Another thing companies can do is hire a consultant to help you with it. What a consultant will do is review your facility for all environmental regulations, not just air, to help you ensure that you're in compliance with all those. As EGLE, we can't recommend specific consultants for you, but we do have a list of consultants within the state of Michigan on our website. We have a webpage that we put together specific for the cannabis industry. There's a link for it at the top of this slide. This webpage includes an abundance of resources related directly to cannabis for all media types with EGLE, such as air, water, and waste. There are pre-recorded trainings available there, guidance documents, white papers, and you can always reach out to work group members when appropriate. if you are unable to find information on the website, you can always reach out to us with questions. So the main takeaways from this presentation are that environmental regulations apply to the cannabis industry, and they are important for protecting Michigan's natural resources. If you have processes such as oil extraction or power generation at your facility, you should be assessing whether you need an air permit or whether an exemption applies and you have appropriate documentation. If you fail to apply for and receive a permit or determine that the exemption applies, you could be in violation and subject to enforcement action. Like I said, we do have many resources available to you, and we welcome any questions you may have.
All right, thank you both for this information. If you'd like access to this presentation at a later date, you will be able to find the recorded session on the CRA's website at michigan.gov/CRA within about a week. So at this time, we will open up the floor for Q&A. Please send us any questions that you may have if you haven't done so already. If a question you submitted does not get answered or you think of something later, please feel free to submit those to our social equity team at CRA-socialequity@michigan.gov. So it looks like we have a couple questions in there. I will turn it back over to you guys.
All right. The first question it looks like we have is, what kinds of laboratory analysis are required for air permitting, and what sorts of accreditation or certifications do those labs require? We don't require any kind of lab analysis unless you're doing some kind of specialty work. Normally what it is you have an SDS of your solvent that you're using, and that should have your density, your percent of solvent if it's a mixture. That's what you would use in your calculations. And then usually your manufacturer of the solvent recovery unit should have any extra information from their website or from the manufacturer itself on how much is supposed to be emitted, like what the worst case of what they assume is emitted in like a pounds per gallon, or an amount of how much solvent per how much process that, or how much biomass is processed. Or sometimes they'll have a percent recovery. They anticipate like a 98% or 95%. And you would use those kind of calculations and want that documentation when you submit an air permit.
Looks like we have another question as well. It says, is an air permit required to get a processing license in 2024? That would probably be a question for the CRA, but my understanding is CRA rules says that you have to be in compliance with EGLE rules to have your license. So I would say yes, if you need a permit, you should get it with us.
All right. And another question is chlorine dioxide use something that would be regulated by EGLE? If this is in like a solvent type situation where you're an extraction situation, then yes. I have not heard of using chlorine dioxide yet, but it seems like every application is different that we receive, and everyone is doing a different process and using different kind of solvents. So it would still need to be evaluated, especially under as a toxic air contaminant. So yes.
Okay, I think that was all of the questions. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for another CRA education session, and a special thank you to Janelle and Nathaniel for taking us through this process. EGLE will be with us again on July 18th, so watch for that upcoming session and others by checking out our calendar of events on the CRA website. As always, we appreciate the participation, and until next time, we have a great afternoon, everyone.